What could make a German soldier, trained, indoctrinated, terrified of capture, look at his British guard and smile? Not freedom. They were still prisoners, locked behind barbed wire, watched by men with rifles. Yes. Not letters from home. Those were rare, heavily censored, sometimes never arrived at all. Not news of German victories. By 1942, there weren't many victories left to celebrate. It was something smaller, something that arrived every Friday at 6 o'clock sharp, something wrapped in yesterday's newspaper that British guards and German prisoners ate together, sitting on the same benches, using the same greasy fingers, consuming identical portions. And here's the strange part. It worked. Camp records show disciplinary incidents dropped markedly every Thursday. German prisoners volunteered for extra work details to earn their Friday meal, even though it wasn't conditional, even though they were getting it regardless. Some marked their calendars with small pencil crosses, counting down the days. The British called it tradition. The Germans called it conspiracy, at first. A psychological trick. Another layer of captivity designed to break their spirits in ways barbed wire couldn't. Then they called it something else entirely. By the time the war ended in 1945, something unprecedented happened. Dozens of German POWs formally requested to stay in Britain, permanently. They wanted to become citizens of the country they'd been sent to destroy. Guards who'd spent years imprisoning these men now wrote letters supporting their asylum applications. And when you understand why, when you grasp what really happened in those camps every Friday for 5 years, you'll understand something profound about human nature, about food, about the invisible power of small repeated kindnesses in the darkest of times. It starts, as these things always do, with fear. Late November 1940. The North Atlantic is a killing field, frigid, dark, prowled by British destroyers hunting German U-boats like wolves tracking wounded deer. U-47 surfaces to recharge batteries. Fatal mistake. HMS Vanquisher's searchlights catch her like a moth pinned to black velvet. The submarine crash dives too late. Depth charges walk across the water, systematic, methodical, devastating. The pressure hull screams. Steel plates buckle. The ocean doesn't care about flags or ideology. It crushes everything equally. 18 men make it out before the boat plunges into darkness, taking 26 others with it. Among the survivors, Paul Schmidt, 20 years old, diesel fuel in his lungs, salt water in his boots, hypothermia already setting in. He watches crewmates die in the minutes before British sailors drag him aboard the destroyer. Not from drowning, they'd made it out of the sub, but from cold. The North Atlantic in November doesn't ask questions, it just takes. Paul survives. But what comes next terrifies him more than drowning. The propaganda had been explicit, graphic. Goebbels' ministry spent years conditioning Wehrmacht soldiers to fear capture above almost everything else. The broadcasts were specific. British camps practice starvation as official policy. Prisoners receive animal feed mixed with sawdust. Some are subjected to medical experiments. All are treated as subhuman, fit only for forced labor and cruelty. One widely circulated pamphlet from 1940 showed emaciated figures behind barbed wire, captioned, "This is what awaits you in British hands." Another claimed Allied forces took revenge for every German bomb by withholding food from prisoners for days at a time. These weren't random scare tactics. They served multiple purposes. Make German soldiers fight harder, make them surrender less willingly, and if captured, make them interpret everything, every action, every meal, every order through a lens of victimhood and suspicion. Paul Schmidt carried this mental framework as HMS Vanquisher transported him and the other survivors to British soil. He'd been trained to expect the worst. His mind, under the stress of capture and survival, searched desperately for patterns that confirmed what he'd been told. When the destroyer docked and British soldiers herded them through grey November rain toward waiting trucks, Paul braced for violence that never came. The guards were stern but not brutal, efficient but not cruel. This confused him more than cruelty would have. The trucks delivered them to Camp 21 in Comrie, Scotland, one of dozens of POW facilities hastily established across Britain in 1940. Originally an old military barracks, now ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers, It would house German prisoners for the next 7 years. The first weeks passed in a fog of routine and suspicion, roll call at dawn regardless of weather, work details during the day, sometimes farm labor, sometimes infrastructure repair, lights out at 10 o'clock, enforced absolutely. The guards, mostly older men from the Home Guard or soldiers deemed unfit for frontline duty, maintained discipline without the savagery the Germans expected. But it was the food that became the first real test of their assumptions. Meals arrived on schedule, always, 3 times daily, portions measured according to Geneva Convention standards. The International Committee of the Red Cross had established clear guidelines in 1929. Prisoners of war must receive food equivalent in quantity and quality to depot troops of the detaining power. Britain took this seriously, not from pure altruism, though some guards genuinely believed in treating prisoners humanely, but from calculated self-interest. By mid-1941, approximately 140,000 British Commonwealth soldiers were held in German stalags. Their treatment depended partly on reciprocity. Both sides maintaining minimum standards meant both sides' prisoners stood a chance of survival, so the Germans at Camp 21 received their 3 meals daily, and those meals were bewildering. The morning meal arrived first, porridge that resembled grey paste, oats boiled into submission, consistency somewhere between cement and pudding, tea so strong it could strip paint from metal, darker than coffee, bitter enough to make Paul's eyes water, bread that crumbled like sawdust when squeezed, its texture wrong, its taste slightly off, because it was stretched with oat flour to extend limited wheat supplies. Paul sat in the mess hall with his tin plate, poking at the porridge. Klaus Hartmann, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Kent 2 months prior, sat across from him. Klaus had been writing in a small diary he'd somehow kept through capture. He wrote in tight, controlled script. The breakfast resembles something scraped from a stable floor. Either British people have no functioning taste buds, or this is intentional demoralization disguised as feeding. The other prisoners nodded in grim agreement. This food wasn't just unfamiliar. It seemed designed to break spirits. Surely this was the beginning. The real punishment would escalate from here. They were wrong, but not in the way they imagined. Lunch brought vegetables, so many vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips, cabbage, all boiled into absolute submission until they surrendered any pretense of flavor, color, or structural integrity. The British kitchen staff, mostly local women volunteers from Comrie village, followed Ministry of Food guidelines with religious devotion. Those guidelines, distributed to every kitchen in Britain, emphasized safety and digestibility above all else. Overcooked vegetables were considered patriotic. One recipe card from 1941, now archived at the Imperial War Museum, suggested boiling cabbage for 25 minutes. 25 minutes, long enough to reduce it to pale, limp submission. The Germans, accustomed to sauerkraut with actual tang and bite, stared at these vegetables and saw confirmation of malicious intent. Paul initially refused to eat the cabbage, convinced it was spoiled. Only hunger, real gnawing hunger, eventually made him try it. It wasn't spoiled. It was just British wartime cooking. Then came items that defied classification entirely. October 1940 brought spotted dick to the menu, a steamed suet pudding studded with currants. The German prisoners examined it with genuine alarm. The name alone sounded like a medical condition. The texture, dense, heavy, vaguely sweet, but also somehow savory, didn't correspond to anything in their culinary experience. Friedrich Weber, a panzer commander captured at Tobruk, reportedly told a guard he'd rather be shot than eat something called dick. The guard, a sheep farmer from the Scottish Highlands, named Robert MacLeod, laughed so hard he had to sit down. He explained it was dessert, traditional. His own mother made it every Sunday. Ferber remained unconvinced. The bread deserved special mention. National wheatmeal bread, introduced across Britain in 1942, was made from flour that included more of the wheat grain than normal, making it denser and darker. To stretch supplies further, bakers added oat flour, potato flour, even ground beans. The result could double as a doorstop. The prisoners nicknamed it Ziegelstein, brick. They'd tap it against tables to demonstrate its density. joke darkly that the British had finally invented edible building materials. Otto Kraus, a baker from Hamburg before the war, examined the bread with professional horror. He told his bunkmates this bread was a crime against wheat, against God, against Germany, in that order. What none of them understood, what they couldn't see because their framework wouldn't allow it, was that this food wasn't punishment, it was just British food. The same meals British families ate at home, sometimes worse because the Geneva Convention actually mandated prisoners receive adequate nutrition while British civilians endured tightening rations. By 1942, butter was limited to 2 ounces per person per week, meat to 1 shilling's worth, sugar to 8 ounces. The Ministry of Food pushed recipes using powdered eggs, dried milk, and vegetables grown in every available garden as part of the Dig for Victory campaign. The boiled cabbage, the reconstituted potato, the brick bread that tasted slightly off, all of it was simply British wartime survival cuisine, grim by necessity, not by design, prepared by women who were doing their best with limited supplies and government guidelines that prioritized safety over flavor, but the Germans couldn't see it that way. Their mental models, built by years of Nazi propaganda about Allied barbarism, interpreted everything as confirmation of expected cruelty. The food was unfamiliar, therefore substandard. It was un-German, therefore punishment. They waited for the cruelty to escalate, for the masks to drop, for the real brutality to begin. They were still waiting when Friday came around. The shift started subtly. Paul Schmidt noticed it first on a Thursday afternoon in December 1940, 6 weeks after his capture. The guards seemed different, lighter, somehow. Their usual stern efficiency hadn't disappeared, but something underneath had changed. Guard Sergeant McLeod, the same man who'd laughed at Weber's spotted dick comment, was actually whistling while walking his patrol route. Whistling, in a prisoner camp, in wartime. By Friday morning, the change was unmistakable. Roll call proceeded as normal, 6 o'clock sharp, prisoners lined up in rows of 10, guards counting, recording, verifying. But afterward, instead of immediate work details, something unusual happened. Small groups of guards gathered near the camp kitchen, talking with an animation Paul hadn't observed before. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a truck arrived. Not the usual supply lorry with its crates of tinned meat and sacks of potatoes, but a smaller van with writing on the side that Paul couldn't read from his barracks window. The guards moved toward it with purpose. Word rippled through the camp in German whispers: something's happening, special delivery, different routine. Different could mean anything, different could mean trouble. When you're locked behind wire, every deviation from routine carries weight. Changes might signal danger, or opportunity, or some new form of psychological warfare. You catalog everything because your life might depend on reading patterns correctly. The kitchen staff, usually methodical and joyless in their efficiency, began moving with something approaching enthusiasm. Wooden boxes emerged from the van, steaming slightly in the December cold. Paul watched from behind the barracks window as the boxes were carried inside, guards following with obvious interest. By 5:30, the smell hit. It cut through everything, the usual camp odors of coal smoke, damp wool, unwashed men living in close quarters, the ever-present Scottish rain. This smell was different, sharp, clean, undeniably food, but not the boiled into submission food they'd been enduring for weeks. Hot oil, salt, something savory and rich and utterly unfamiliar, but unmistakably appetizing in a way nothing else had been since capture. The prisoners drifted toward barracks windows, trying to identify the source. Some of the older soldiers recognized the smell of frying from their own Wehrmacht field kitchens. But this was different, richer, with a sharp tang they couldn't place. Then the guards started queuing. That's what made it truly strange. These British soldiers, who maintained strict separation from prisoners, who enforced discipline and distance, who never showed weakness or favoritism, they were now standing in an actual queue outside the kitchen block, not tense or formal, chatting, laughing, like schoolboys waiting for sweets. Sergeant McLeod stood near the front, joking with younger guards about something Paul couldn't hear. When the first guards received their portions, newspaper-wrapped bundles that left immediate grease stains spreading across yesterday's headlines, they didn't march off to eat in private or maintain professional distance. They sat right there on benches in full view of the prisoners, and they unwrapped their prizes with something approaching reverence. MacLeod bit into whatever was in his parcel and actually closed his eyes in satisfaction, a visible, unmistakable expression of pleasure, the kind of reaction that can't be faked. Paul turned to Klaus, who was also watching from the window. "It's a trick," Klaus whispered. "They want us to see them enjoying it. Then they'll give us something else, something worse." It made sense. Perfect psychological warfare. Show the prisoners something good, something the guards clearly love, then deny it or taint it, or use it as leverage. Classic manipulation. But then came the call for prisoner mess. The announcement echoed across the compound. "Evening meal. All prisoners to queue." The Germans approached the mess hall with extreme wariness. The smell was stronger now, almost overwhelming. Whatever the guards had received was clearly being prepared in quantity. The kitchen windows glowed with unusual activity. The serving window opened, and there it was. Newspaper-wrapped parcels, still hot, grease already seeping through the paper, identical to what the guards had received. The kitchen staff, the same tired women who'd been serving grey porridge and limp cabbage for weeks, distributed these parcels with the same efficiency as always. No malice, no smirking satisfaction, just tired humans doing their job. Each prisoner received one parcel. Paul took his, feeling the heat through the paper, and carried it back to his table. Around him, hundreds of German prisoners did the same. The mess hall filled with the sound of rustling newspaper, and the pervasive smell of hot oil and salt. Then silence. Nobody wanted to be first. Nobody wanted to discover what fresh humiliation the British had devised. The parcels sat there steaming, newsprint curling slightly from the heat, while an entire hall of German soldiers engaged in a silent standoff with Friday dinner. The absurdity wasn't lost on Paul. Grown men soldiers who'd faced combat, who'd survived their submarine sinking, who'd endured weeks of captivity, paralyzed by fear of food. Eventually, hunger won. It always does. Paul Schmidt made a decision. He'd survived the North Atlantic. He'd survived capture. He'd survived 6 weeks of British cooking that seemed designed to kill through sheer joylessness. Whatever this was, poison, punishment, psychological warfare, he'd rather face it than endure another night of wandering. He unwrapped his parcel with the caution of a man defusing ordnance. The newspaper peeled back. He noticed it was the Daily Mirror from 2 days prior, something about Churchill's latest speech smudged into the grease. Then the paper revealed its contents. 2 pieces, both golden brown, both still crackling faintly with residual heat from recent frying. The first piece was clearly fish, but unlike any fish preparation Paul had ever seen. Back in Bavaria, fish came poached, or lightly pan-fried, or baked with herbs. This fish was encased in something that looked almost architectural, a coating, thick, ridged, crispy, that protected the flesh beneath. Where the coating had broken, Paul could see white flesh, flaky and steaming. The second piece was potato, but transformed, not the sad waterlogged boiled cubes they'd been choking down all week. These were thick-cut, substantial, with golden edges gone dark and caramelized. When Paul broke one open experimentally, the inside was fluffy and steaming, creating visible vapor in the cold mess hall air. Salt crystals caught the light, and there was liquid pooled at the bottom of the newspaper. Paul touched it cautiously with one finger, then brought it to his nose. Sharp, acidic, not unpleasant. Vinegar, he realized, though more aggressive than the delicate wine vinegars his mother used on Sunday salads. Around the hall, other prisoners were conducting similar investigations. Tentative, suspicious, still waiting for the trap to spring. Paul lifted the fish piece. It was hot enough to require juggling between fingers. He could feel the heat through the crispy coating. He bit down. The batter shattered first, that satisfying crunch that activates something primal in human brains, probably left over from when our ancestors discovered fire and crispy things became possible. The coating broke into shards, and then his teeth met the fish itself, cod, though he didn't know that yet. Mild, clean tasting, the kind of fish that doesn't fight you with oiliness or aggressive flavor. The batter had protected it during frying, creating a steam pocket that kept the flesh impossibly moist while building that textural contrast between crunch and tenderness. Paul's face must have betrayed him because the entire mess hall was watching. He chewed slowly, processing sensory information that contradicted every expectation he'd brought to this meal. This wasn't punishment. This wasn't substandard prison food designed to break spirits. This was actually good. Not just edible, not just acceptable. Genuinely, deeply satisfying in a way that transcended circumstances. He reached for a chip. That's what the British called these potato pieces. Klaus had learned from a guard, dunked it in the vinegar pooled at the bottom of the newspaper, and bit down. The potato collapsed into a fluffy interior, while the exterior maintained its crispy integrity. The vinegar cut through the oil, creating a balance that made you want another bite immediately. The science behind his reaction was straightforward, though Paul didn't know it. Fat, salt, and the Maillard reaction, the chemical process that browns food and creates complex flavors during cooking, were hitting pleasure receptors that had been dormant since capture. The crispy texture activated mechanoreceptors in ways that soft-boiled food simply couldn't. And perhaps most importantly, watching the guards eat identical meals had dissolved the psychological barrier the prisoners had constructed. This wasn't them versus us. This was just Friday. Around the hall, other prisoners began unwrapping their parcels. The collective realization spread like a wave breaking on shore. Otto Kraus, the baker who'd condemned British bread as a war crime against wheat, bit into his fish and actually laughed, a surprised bark of sound that startled everyone, including himself. His face transformed from suspicion to confusion to genuine pleasure in the span of 5 seconds. Friedrich Weber, who'd refused the spotted dick and told the guard he'd rather be shot, consumed his entire portion in under 3 minutes. When he finished, he spent the next 5 minutes licking grease from his fingers and staring at the empty newspaper with something resembling grief. The meal was over. He wouldn't get another until next Friday. Paul watched Sergeant McLeod walk through the mess hall, ostensibly checking that order was maintained, but really enjoying the spectacle. The sergeant's face showed satisfaction, not cruel satisfaction at having broken the prisoner's will, but simple human satisfaction at watching other humans discover something good. Ernst Müller, a U-boat engineer captured with Paul, called out to McLeod in broken English. "Every Friday." McLeod nodded. "Every Friday, lad." Müller translated for his table. The response was immediate. 7 grown men, soldiers who'd faced combat and capture, who'd maintained discipline through weeks of uncertainty, broke into genuine smiles. For the first time since the North Atlantic had swallowed their submarine, Paul Schmidt felt something other than fear or suspicion or exhausted numbness. He felt a small, cautious flicker of something that might in time become hope. Within days, letters started flowing out of Camp 21. The International Committee of the Red Cross facilitated correspondence between POWs and their families, though every letter passed through censors on both sides. German military censors looked for intelligence leaks or morale problems. British censors checked for coded messages or security risks. What neither side expected was the flood of commentary about Friday dinners. Klaus Hartmann wrote to his wife in Stuttgart in December 1941, "You will not believe what I must tell you. The British have a custom. Every Friday, without fail, they eat fish fried in a shell of crisp dough with potatoes prepared in a way I cannot adequately describe. The guards eat this same meal. The same Maria. I watched Sergeant McLeod and a British private and our Oberleutnant Schneider all eating from identical parcels. For 20 minutes on Friday evening, there are no enemies in this camp. Only men eating fish." His wife kept that letter for 40 years, eventually preserving it between the pages of a family Bible. After Klaus returned home in 1947, after he'd resumed his law practice, after he'd tried and failed to explain to German friends what the war had been like, this letter remained. Physical evidence of a moment when the world made slightly more sense than it should have. The archives at the Imperial War Museum in London contain hundreds of these letters, collected and catalogued decades later, when former POWs or their families donated personal papers. A pattern emerges across the correspondence. Initial suspicion giving way to confusion, then reluctant appreciation, finally something approaching anticipation. Paul Schmidt wrote to his mother in March 1942, "I have marked my calendar, 4 more days until Friday. Does this make me a collaborator, Mutti, that I look forward to my captor's food? But you must understand, after 6 days of grey meals, that taste of nothing but duty and rationing, Friday brings color and warmth, and the small mercy of something that tastes intentional. As if someone wanted it to taste good. That matters more than I can explain." Camp records from facilities across Britain document a behavioral shift that puzzled officers on both sides. At Camp 21 in Comrie, the commanding officer noted in his log dated July 1942, disciplinary incidents drop markedly from Wednesday onward each week. Prisoners appear to moderate behavior in anticipation of Friday meal privileges. This is not official policy. Fish and chips are standard ration, not reward. Yet the psychological effect is undeniable. Other camps reported similar patterns. Prisoners volunteered for extra work details on Thursdays, not to earn their Friday meal, which they were getting anyway, but because the ritual had acquired meaning beyond nutrition. Some prisoners began requesting British cookbooks through the Red Cross, though most requests were denied because books counted against limited mail quotas. Friedrich Weber, the panzer commander who'd initially refused Spotted Dick, wrote multiple letters to his sister in Munich, asking her to document any information she could find about the batter process for fried fish in the English style. He was planning, he told her, to open a restaurant after the war serving authentic British Friday food in Bavaria. His sister thought he'd lost his mind. German censors flagged the letters as potentially suspicious. Was batter code for something? Before concluding the poor man was genuinely obsessed with fried fish, the psychological impact went deeper than appetite. These men existed in a state of suspended animation. The war continued without them. Their futures remained uncertain. Their families faced dangers they couldn't protect against. Control had been stripped away completely. But Friday became a fixed point, a reliable pleasure in a world of unreliable everything else. Dr. Franz Becker, a military physician captured at Tobruk in 1942 and held at a camp in Derbyshire, wrote in his journal, "The human spirit requires small kindnesses to survive prolonged hardship. I didn't expect the British to understand this. Yet here we are. Every Friday, a small kindness arrives wrapped in newspaper. I have begun to suspect they understand human nature better than we were trained to believe." Some guards began explaining the tradition's origins. How fish and chips became working-class staple food in Victorian England. How Friday's Catholic tradition of meatless days merged with cheap-filling street food sold from carts and small shops. How the combination battered fish and chipped potatoes became so embedded in British culture that even war couldn't disrupt it. The prisoners listened with genuine interest, asking questions, drawing parallels to their own food cultures. These conversations represented something rare in wartime, enemy soldiers, discussing something other than conflict, finding common ground in something as simple as hot food and hunger satisfied. One exchange, recorded in Camp 21's records from September 1943, captures the dynamic. A prisoner asks Sergeant McLeod why the British were so particular about Friday fish. McLeod thought for a moment, then said, "Because it reminds us we're still civilized. War makes animals of men, but sitting down to proper fish and chips on Friday, that's human. That's what we're fighting to keep." The prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Heinrich Vogel, later wrote about that conversation, "I realized then that we were not so different. They fight to preserve their Fridays, we fought to impose our Führer's vision, and now I'm not certain which cause better serves humanity." These were dangerous thoughts for a German soldier to commit to paper, even in a British camp where censorship focused on operational security rather than ideological purity. But Vogel wrote them anyway. The letter never made it past British censors, but it survived in camp records, testimony to a moral reckoning happening in real time, one fish and chips meal at a time. To understand what made the Friday tradition so powerful, so psychologically transformative, you need to understand what these German prisoners expected based on their own military's treatment of captured enemies. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear rules. Prisoners of war must receive food equivalent in quality and quantity to depot troops of the detaining power. Britain took this seriously, not from pure altruism, but from calculated self-interest. By 1942, approximately 170,000 British Commonwealth soldiers were held in German captivity. Their survival depended partly on reciprocity, both sides maintaining minimum standards, but implementation varied wildly depending on which enemy you'd been fighting. Western Front prisoners, British, American, French, generally received treatment roughly aligned with Geneva standards in German stalags, not comfortable, often not truly adequate, but survivable. The numbers tell part of the story. Of British and American POWs held by Germany, approximately 4% died in captivity. Grim numbers, unacceptable losses. But within the cruel arithmetic of wartime detention, the Eastern Front told a completely different story. German treatment of Soviet POWs represented systematic extermination dressed as administrative neglect. Camp Stalag 326 in Stukenbrock held primarily Soviet prisoners. By war's end, over 65,000 had died there, most from starvation and disease that German commanders could have prevented but chose not to. The Nazi racial ideology deemed Slavic peoples Untermenschen, subhuman, unworthy of Geneva Convention protections. The Soviet Union hadn't signed the convention anyway, giving Germany a legal excuse for what was fundamentally an ideological choice to let men starve. Soviet POWs in German camps received perhaps 700 calories daily if they were lucky. Enough to extend dying, not enough to sustain life. Men were reduced to eating grass, bark, anything to fill stomachs that had stopped sending hunger signals because the body was already consuming itself. Of the 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured by Germany, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity.
Some German prisoners in British camps had come from the Eastern Front. They'd witnessed or participated in this system. When these same soldiers arrived in British camps, receiving 2,500 to 3,000 calories daily, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Hans Dietrich, the prisoner who'd initially suspected Friday fish was a trick, had served in Ukraine in 9. He'd seen the camps, he knew what was happening even if official policy discouraged open discussion. In 1943, from his bunk in Camp 21, he wrote to a friend captured at the same time but held in a different British camp. "I cannot reconcile what I saw us do with what they do to us. Either we are not the men I thought we were, or they are not the enemy I was told to fight. I think both might be true, and that knowledge sits heavy." The philosophical difference ran deeper than calories. British camp commanders following War Office directives operated on a principle: prisoners remained soldiers, temporarily detained, entitled to dignity within the constraints of security. Their captivity was circumstantial, not moral. German doctrine on the Eastern Front operated differently. Prisoners were defeated enemies, their labor and lives forfeit to the Reich's needs. Their captivity was both practical and ideological. They were inferior beings whose suffering was inevitable and perhaps deserved. This wasn't just policy difference. It reflected fundamentally divergent views on human value during wartime. By 1943, as more prisoners arrived from North Africa campaigns, British camps had evolved sophisticated systems. Prisoners could organize education classes, stage theatrical productions, receive musical instruments through the Red Cross. Camp 18-6 in Lancashire formed a full orchestra, 23 German musicians performing Beethoven for British guards and German prisoners alike. The same camp served fish and chips every Friday without fail through 1944. Even as V-2 rockets fell on London, even as British civilians died in their homes, even as the war ground into its darkest years, the Friday tradition continued. The contrast wasn't lost on the prisoners. Klaus Hartmann, the Luftwaffe pilot, who'd initially complained about porridge resembling stable scrapings, wrote in December 1943, "We are treated better as enemies than we treated conquered peoples as victors. This knowledge sits heavy. I think of the Polish families whose homes we requisitioned in 1939. Did we feed them? Did we think of their Fridays? These questions haunt me more than memories of combat." These were dangerous thoughts for a German soldier to commit to paper. The letter never made it past British censors, but it survived in camp records, testimony to a moral reckoning happening in real time. The fish and chips became symbolic of this larger dynamic. When British guards and German prisoners ate identical meals every Friday, it was a weekly demonstration of a principle: we are not you, we do not starve prisoners, we maintain standards even when our enemy doesn't. For some German POWs, this was their first encounter with the idea that military power could be exercised with restraint. That strength didn't require cruelty to prove itself. that the strong could afford mercy precisely because they were strong. It was a lesson delivered not through speeches or propaganda or formal instruction, but through something as simple as fried fish and potatoes wrapped in newspaper. Every Friday, 6 o'clock sharp, for 5 years. The war ended in May 1945, but prisoners didn't go home immediately. Repatriation took months, sometimes years. German POWs remained in British camps through 1946 and 1947, working on farms to address Britain's labour shortage, helping rebuild infrastructure their bombers had damaged. During this strange interim period, no longer enemies, not yet free, the Friday tradition continued. By this point, some prisoners had been eating fish and chips nearly every week for 5 years. It had become their tradition as much as Britain's. Otto Kraus, the baker from Hamburg, had learned to help prepare it in the camp kitchen. Friedrich Weber had finally opened that restaurant in Bavaria, not serving fish and chips. Post-war Germany had more pressing concerns, but using British cooking techniques he'd learned from watching camp kitchen staff. When repatriation finally came, some prisoners requested one final Friday meal before boarding trains to Dover and ships back to Germany. Camp commanders, many of whom had developed complicated relationships with long-term charges, often obliged. At Camp 21 in Comrie, the last group of German prisoners departed in February 1948. Sergeant MacLeod, who'd served at the camp since 1941, shook hands with men he'd guarded for 7 years. "Don't forget your Fridays," he told them. Several prisoners admitted they'd miss the routine more than they'd miss anything else about captivity. The decades that followed brought unexpected developments. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, former POWs began returning to Britain as tourists. Some came seeking battlefields or memorials. Others came specifically searching for the fish and chip shops nearest their former camps. In 1962, Friedrich Weber, the panzer commander who'd once declared he'd rather be shot than eat spotted dick, returned to Britain with his family. They drove to Derby, located the shop that had supplied his camp, and ordered cod and chips. His daughter Greta later recalled her father weeping quietly as he ate, though he couldn't or wouldn't explain why. Heinrich Vogel, who'd written about guards and prisoners eating identical meals, became a schoolteacher in Stuttgart after the war. He taught English and history. Every year he'd tell his students about Fridays in the camp. In 1971, he organised a school trip to Britain. The official purpose was educational: Tower of London, Stratford-upon-Avon, the usual curriculum-approved sites. But Vogel's real goal was introducing his students to fish and chips. He took 30 German teenagers to a shop in Lancaster, near where his camp had been. They ate on benches outside, newspaper grease staining their hands, vinegar sharp in the autumn air. "This," he told them, "is what taught me that enemies are made, not born, and what is made can be unmade." Paul Schmidt, the young submariner who'd survived the North Atlantic and been the first in his mess hall to try the Friday meal, lived until 2019. He died at age 97 in a small town outside Munich. His family reported that until his final years, he insisted on fish and chips every Friday, prepared exactly as he remembered. Crispy batter, proper chips, malt vinegar, salt, wrapped in newspaper, though health regulations no longer allowed actual newspaper wrapping. When asked why he maintained the tradition 7 decades after liberation, he said simply, "It reminds me that people are just people, even when governments tell us otherwise. That lesson cost millions of lives to learn. I honor it every Friday." His local German newspaper printed the obituary alongside 2 photographs. One showed Paul at age 23 in British captivity, thin and uncertain but alive. The other showed him at age 95 holding a parcel of fish and chips, grinning at the camera. The same smile in both photographs. The smile of a man who discovered something unexpected and chose never to forget it. Every Friday, 6 o'clock, wrapped in newspaper. A small tradition, a simple meal, and a lesson about humanity that persisted long after the war that taught it ended.